It is Friday. It's the 18th of July. You're watching ARIRANG Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gon-young. We begin with another tragedy. The world is still reeling after Malaysia Airlines passenger plane carrying 298 people was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing everyone on board. Pro-Russian separatists are suspected of the missile attack, which Ukraine has branded an act of terrorism. First, here's our Kim Byoungjoo.
The Malaysian Airlines aircraft, a Boeing 777, was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it fell near the city of Donetsk, a restive area close to the Russian border, which has become a stronghold for pro-Russian rebels. Ukraine's Interior Ministry advisor says the plane, which was flying at 33,000 feet, was brought down by a ground-to-air missile. Both the Ukrainian government and the pro-Russian separatist rebels immediately blamed each other for the crash.
We do not exclude the possibility that this plane was also shot down and stressed that Ukrainian armed forces did not perform any actions to fire at targets in the air.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming the Ukrainian government for the crash, saying that Kiev bears some responsibility for the fighting that may have led to the jet's apparent downing by missile. The U.S. government says it will offer any assistance necessary to Ukraine to determine the cause of the crash.
I offered President Poroshenko the help of our expertise, our National Transportation Safety Group, and other experts in the community. He accepted that help, and they will be on their way rapidly to see if we can get to the bottom of this.
More than half of those on board were Dutch nationals. There were also 27 Australians, 23 Malaysians, 11 Indonesians, and various other nationalities. More than 40 remain unverified. Korea's foreign ministry says it's unlikely any Korean passengers were on the plane. Other airlines have announced they are now diverting flights around eastern Ukraine. Kim Byoungjoo, ARIRANG News.
And the UN Security Council is set to hold an emergency meeting in about 7 hours' time to discuss Thursday's downing of the Malaysian airliner. Earlier, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called for a, quote, a full and transparent international investigation into the crash. So if you remember correctly, this is the second disaster that has happened in less than 5 months in terms of a Malaysian Airlines downing. Of course, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 vanished from radar back in March, and it remains missing to this day, with more questions and answers about its ultimate fate. And now the downing of Flight 17 with nearly 300 people on board. Our Kim Byoungjoo reports on the recent tragedies and another from more than 30 years ago that's eerily reminiscent.
Mystery still surrounds Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 that went missing back in March with still no sign of any wreckage or the 239 people who were on board. The Boeing jetliner en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing is believed to have crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Despite massive international search efforts, the accident still remains unsolved, and investigators appear no closer to determining what happened to the plane than they were 4 months ago. And now another tragedy involving a Malaysia Airlines flight, this one shot down, killing everyone on board. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak says the attack was a shock and ordered an immediate investigation. In the span of less than 5 months, some 530 people have been killed while flying on Malaysia Airlines planes. It puts the future of the company in question. The crisis also brings to mind a similar attack from 3 decades earlier. In September 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 bound for Seoul from New York was shot down by a Soviet fighter plane, killing all 269 people on board. The attack came during the peak of the Cold War and further heightened tensions between the West and the Soviet Union. The Korean airliner was shot down after being mistaken as a reconnaissance plane. The downing of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 and the deaths of nearly 300 innocent lives appears to also be the result of tensions between states. Kim Byoungjoo, ARIRANG News.
Now, shifting our focus, North Korea has become a member of an international organization designed to combat money laundering and terror-related financing. The Asia-Pacific Group on Monday, Money Laundering, or APG, approved Pyongyang's application to be an observer on Thursday. The North has agreed to abide by the entry conditions, but will be under close observation for 3 years to see if it follows its commitments. And if it does, it will then be eligible for full membership. Some have questioned the North's intentions about joining the organization. Established in 1997, the APG consists of 41 member nations. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council has denounced North Korea's recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests. Officials say the fact that the Security Council has even addressed this issue shows how seriously the international community views the situation. Here's our Choi-sun.
Following a closed-door meeting on Thursday, the United Nations Security Council called on North Korea to stop its recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests.
The members of the Security Council condemned these launches as violations of Security Council resolutions 1718 2006, 1874 2009, 2087 2013 and 2094 2013, and urged the DPRK to fully comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
The Council's condemnation comes after Pyongyang launched 3 rounds of Scud short-range ballistic missiles between June 29th and July 13th toward the East Sea off the Korean peninsula. For conducting 3 nuclear tests and repeatedly testing its short to long-range ballistic missiles since 2006, North Korea has been banned by the UN from any type of ballistic missile or nuclear-related activity. The Council had previously released a statement denouncing the North's medium-range Nodong missile launch in March. South Korean officials say it's very unusual for the Security Council to discuss the regime's short-range missile testing.
It's meaningful that the Council and not the North Korea Sanctions Committee discussed the issue after recognizing that the frequent short-range missiles on the Korean peninsula were threatening international peace and security.
Pyongyang is expected to protest the latest statement out of the United Nations. In response to the statement in March, North Korea threatened to carry out what it called a new form of nuclear test. Choi-sun, ARIRANG News.
Well, back here in the peninsula, working-level talks to discuss the details of North Korea's participation in the upcoming Asian Games in South Korea ended Thursday when the North Korean delegation stormed out of the room. Well, on this Friday, the North accuses South of acting in bad faith. Our Unification Ministry correspondent Hwang Sang-hee reports.
North Korea threatened Friday to reconsider its decision to participate in the upcoming Incheon Asian Games, pinning the failure of Thursday's working-level talks squarely on the South. Through its state-run Korean Central News Agency Friday, the North criticized the South Korean delegation for what it called an insincere attitude in the latter half of the meeting, claiming it came under the directive of the presidential office of Cheongwade. It accused the South of taking issue with the number of North Korean cheerleaders and the size of the North Korean flag that would be used during the Games. Should Seoul maintain such a stance, Pyongyang threatened to reconsider its plans to participate in the sporting event. South Korea's Unification Ministry expressed deep regrets about North Korea's angry outburst and called for Pyongyang to return to talks with sincerity. The two Koreas met at the border village of Panmunjom on Thursday to discuss the details of the 700 North Korean athletes and cheerleaders that were planning to make the trip south for the Incheon Asian Games, which begin in September. But when South Korea asked for more details on its plans and said it would accommodate the North Korean delegation just as it would any other team that's participating in the Games, North Korea walked away, questioning Seoul's motives. The two sides have not set a date for their next meeting. While some experts had hoped the Asian Games could become a platform for improved inter-Korean ties, Thursday's meeting shows that the two sides still remain far apart. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. It's Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
South Korea and China are making slow but steady progress in bilateral free trade talks. On certain issues, the two sides are seeing eye to eye, while on others, they still remain far apart. Our Song Ji-sun has more on Seoul and Beijing's 12th round of negotiations.
South Korea and China have been working to draw up a free trade deal for more than 2 years now, and the two sides are drawing closer to an agreement.
We have made notable progress in this round of negotiations. We have reached an agreement in principle on market liberalization in the service and investment sectors.
The two sides agreed to start with a positive list approach, in which they will list items and areas to be liberalized, and then switch to a negative list approach within a certain period of time. In a negative list agreement, all items and services are liberalized with the exception of those named. It represents the first time Beijing has agreed to this approach. As for products and sensitive agriculture industry, the two sides are still narrowing differences, but Seoul is firm that it won't allow cheaper Chinese products to take hold of the domestic market.
When we moved into the second stage of the FTA talks, we were sure that we could protect our agricultural sector by including the majority of our products in the extremely sensitive list. China, on the other hand, wants steel and machineries included in the list.
The two sides were eager to make progress at these negotiations, the first since Presidents Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping agreed in summit talks early this month to finalize a bilateral trade pact by the end of this year. The next round of negotiations is set for September in China. Song Ji-sun, ARIRANG News, Sejong.
Uncharted path. That is the way Seoul's new finance minister is describing the road ahead for the Korean economy in terms of future challenges. Well, in its first economic ministerial meeting since taking office, Choi Kyung-won said that there was an urgent need for comprehensive and aggressive measures to address lingering problems like slumping household income and sluggish investment, this due to a lack of entrepreneurship. He added that the economy is recovering at a much weaker pace than expected and that the momentum could wane at any moment. However, the premium on Korean bonds, which is, of course, a barometer measuring the nation's default risk, has dropped to its lowest level since the 2008 global financial crisis. And that's according to market researcher Super Derivatives. The credit default swap premium on the country's 5-year foreign exchange stabilization bond was traded at 49.26 basis points early this week. Well, the figure is roughly 1/15 of the 699 basis points posted in October 2008 following the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Now, the lowering of the CDS premium means that foreign investors look positively on the Korean economy. Experts attribute the sharp decline to Korea's economic stability backed by its continued current account surplus streak and strong foreign exchange reserves. The number of inbound flights into Korea continues to ascend. Seoul's transport ministry says more than 300,000 flights landed in the country in the first half of this year, which is the highest figure ever for that period and a 6% jump on year. Now, the hike is due in part to the rising number of Chinese visitors to this country. Inbound flights from China were up 17% on year from January to June. And the number of flights from overseas into Korea has been on a steady rise over the past 10 years, with the exception of 2005 and 2009, when global financial factors kept the figures low. Now, the global smart home market, that's right, not smartphone, but smart home market, is forecast to double over the next 5 years, and this driven largely by demand in the United States. That's according to market research firm Strategy Analytics, and according to them, 26% of broadband households in the world will have at least one smart home system by 2019. So the revenues in the U.S. will account for nearly 40% of the global total this year, with more than 20 million households spending billions of dollars on smart home systems. Well, growth in the U.S. is being fueled by entrance of corporations like Apple, Google, and Samsung. The research firm says the smart home industry is set to become a major market opportunity for technology and service providers over the next 5 years. Korean government has announced that it'll liberalize the nation's rice market starting next year. Well, it was a decision that came after much deliberation and has been met with fierce resistance from farmers' unions within the country. First, here's our Hwang Ji-hye.
Korea will open its rice market next year. Agriculture Minister Lee Dong-pil said Friday that it's simply too costly to import more rice, which was the trade-off for postponing rice market liberalization. Korea promised to open up its rice market under a 1994 agreement with the World Trade Organization, but because rice is a Korean staple food, the country was allowed to push back the date for 20 years in exchange for gradually raising its rice import quota. That extension is set to expire at the end of this year.
The import quota of over 400,000 tons this year, which makes up 9% of the nation's total rice consumption based on 2013, is a heavy burden on the nation's overall rice market, especially when rice consumption continues to drop in Korea.
While the government says it will protect the domestic market by imposing high tariffs on foreign rice, it did not provide specific numbers. Pundits are expecting the tariff rate to fall at around 400%. They say that level of tariff would ensure that Korean rice maintains its price competitiveness against Chinese or American rice, which can cost half the price or even less. The government also laid out plans to support the nation's rice industry through an insurance program meant to stabilize rural household incomes. Korean farmers, however, on Friday continued a massive protest that began the day before. They said they intended to protect the nation's food sovereignty that the government seems to have handed away.
The government is leaving a jar of rice to the US and China or other countries rich in grain. This will never guarantee the food security of Koreans.
The government plans to set the nation's tariff rate on rice and have it verified by the WTO by this September. It said it would work hard to gain full understanding from local farmers about the change. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
So with that decision to open the rice market and end a 20-year waiver, this country now has to wrestle with tariff rates that'll determine how it protects the nation's farmers who are already under threat by cheaper food imports under a slew of free trade agreements. Well, joining me live in the studio to discuss this issue is our regular contributor, Dr. Kim Byoungjoo. So, Dr. Kim, today's decision follows years of controversy over the pros and cons of opening up a market that for Koreans is synonymous with, food and psychological security. So, how do you best explain the government situation?
To simply put, the oversupply of rice and also possibility of price collapse or price decline, those are the key ideas for the government as it's advocating the tariffication of the system itself from the current system of offering MMA. MMA-based, the mandatory import is what you see on the screen here on the left side here. MMA meaning minimum market access. Because Korea has been postponing opening its rice market, as a WTO member, Korea has an obligation to accept these increasing amount of imports over the years now. And now at this juncture, those people who are advocating to continue on with the current system is saying that we should, negotiate with other WTO members to keep this system in place. But the thing is, when they say so, they say, well, we should take the case of Philippines case and then we should follow their case. The thing is, what happened in the Philippines is, as you can see on the screen here, right now Korea is importing about 400,000 tons every year, right? And the Philippines, they had to more than double, 2.3 times. They had to increase the MMA import. So that means for Korea's case, this is going way over 800,000 tons every year. The thing is, right at this point, Korea is already having this reserve of 500,000 tons of rice imports that have been imported under this MMA system. But on the right-hand side on the screen, as you can see, Korea's consumption of the rice is continuously decreasing. So clearly, if we continue on with this current system, according to the government, we can easily see the oversupply continuing and also price of the rice being materialized, obviously. So that is what I think is that's how we should summarize the situation right at this point.
Right. I think up until this point, the government and many interest groups have been debating over whether this approach, so putting tariffs and ending this waiver program, is better, or whether we should follow Philippines' case where not the tariffs but extending a waiver, however, doubling or tripling the imports. So I suppose the tariffication is a more feasible way. So how is this tariffication going to be imposed?
Okay, let's explain with the illustration that we have prepared on the screen here. Basically, what's happening is if we compare the rice prices of different countries here, Korean rice price is what you see on the left-hand side at this point. This is Korean won per kilogram, so 2,189 won per kilogram. I think it was last year's number. And compare that with the United States rice. So Korea's rice, in this case, is about like 3 times more expensive. And comparing with Chinese rice, ours is about twice more expensive. Now, going with the tariffication rather than MMA system that we saw previously, this is a tariffication scheme here. If we go with, for instance, Korea succeeds in setting up 300% tariff. That's what you see with this kind of like a yellowish bar in the center there. That will be the rise of these prices of these imports, U.S. rice and then Chinese rice. And the purple bars, if Korea succeeds with in imposing 400% tariffs, which looks like a Korean government's goal at this point. Korean government will not release or disclose its goal at this point because it needs to be negotiated, but it will be somewhere between 300, 400 here. And so that's the price rise of the imports that we're seeing here. And the government is saying this is a better way to preserve our rice market rather than continuing on with the MMA system, as I mentioned, that will probably lead to further oversupply and possible, the further decline of the rice price. So this is what we see at this juncture.
I suppose giving Korean rice the price competitive edge.
Exactly.
Right. We were initially expecting a united opposition from rice farmers, and that's not what we're seeing. It seems that they're divided.
Indeed. I think I noticed that's quite interesting because initially we were all expecting quite a strong opposition from the Korean rice farmers as well as Korea's political opposition as well. But now among the Korean rice farmers, we notice division. The traditionally tough or aggressive group called the Federation of Korean Farmers, they're saying, switching to tariffication away from MMA system is not an option, and Korean government is making a mistake by declaring to make the switch here. They say we should continue on with MMA because of the argument that Hwang Ji has reported on, this food sovereignty and all this kind of traditional argument here. But however, a bigger organization, the biggest organization called Association of Korea's Agricultural Business, including big and small farmers here, they're saying, well, they recognize the necessity of having to switch to tariffication here, and they're saying government should totally focus on getting as high tariff level as possible. So indeed, it's quite interesting to see this slight division in terms of the position within among the farmers here.
Well, the first group that we talked about, I'm just curious, what is their argument in terms of, if we extend the MMA system, then we'll have to double, triple the amount of rice imports, and that would, negatively impact Korean rice?
That's a great point, and I don't have an answer for them here because, they're just making an argument the way I see it that will entail all these problems that we have already discussed here. So I don't have the details about, their response to those kind of possible problems here.
Right. So, okay, in general, what is the road ahead here in Korea, and both here in Korea and at the WTO?
At the WTO, by September, Korean government will have to report our, negotiating conditions that will be dealt with through the negotiations with the members of the WTO. And by January, if Korea is firm in terms of switching to tariffication, Korean government will have to impose these tariffs kind of conditionally. conditional upon the future negotiation with WTO members. It will be later finalized, and after that, when the negotiation with WTO members is done, National Assembly will have to come in to ratify it. And even before that, actually, before January, now Korean government will have to change all these small regulations at the lower level. A lot of work to do for Korean government.
You know, I'll bet one of the key tasks for the Korean government is to, clearly explain to the public why this is the way that we should be going, and convince and persuade the public that this is the right way to go.
That's really true.
Communication has always been a problem, and I hope they improve on that.
I agree.
All right, Dr. Kim Byoungjoo, thank you so much for today. And that is your business today on this Friday. Thank you for watching, and join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.